The knock came at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening in the autumn of 1884, and Patrick Keller's hand was already on the latch before his mind had a single chance to remind him why he never answered the door anymore. He stood there in the dim interior of his homestead cabin, fingers curled around the cold iron of the latch, heart thudding in a way it had not done in what felt like a lifetime. The fire behind him snapped and hissed. The wind outside moved through the cottonwoods along Dry Creek with a low, mournful sound that he had grown accustomed to treating as company. He had not opened this door to another living soul in 3 years. Not to the postmaster from Calico Falls who rode out twice to bring him letters he had not asked for. Not to the circuit preacher who had called twice and prayed loudly on the porch steps before giving up. Not to his nearest neighbor, old Tom Grady, who had stood outside for 20 minutes one January morning hollering about a wolf problem, before finally accepting that Patrick Keller was done with the business of other people. And yet something happened now that had not happened on any of those other occasions. His fingers did not let go of the latch. They pressed down, and the door swung inward, and the cold evening air came rushing in along with the smell of sage and dust, and the faint sweetness of coming rain. She was standing on his porch in a traveling coat the color of dark burgundy, the hem caked with red clay mud, her dark hair half escaped from its pins and blowing against her cheek. A battered carpetbag hung from her left hand and a folded paper map from her right, and she was looking at him with eyes that were neither frightened nor particularly pleased to see him. They were simply exhausted, the kind of exhausted that lives in the bones rather than the face. She said, "I am very sorry to disturb you. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back on the Calico Road and then had the sense to find its way to your fence line. I have been walking since just before sundown, and I do not know this country, and I am asking if you have a lantern I could borrow to find my way into town." Patrick stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long and strange between them, filled only with the sound of the wind and the fire and somewhere in the near dark the patient shifting of a horse at his fence. "Come in," he said, and the words came out rough from disuse. She hesitated for one brief second, as if she was weighing the wisdom of stepping into the cabin of a man she had never seen before in her life, in a territory she had only arrived in 3 days prior, with darkness coming on fast. Then she stepped inside, because she was a practical woman, and practical women weighed their options and chose the least dangerous one. Standing alone on an open plain in western Kansas in the dark was considerably more dangerous than a man with tired eyes and no apparent weapon. Patrick pulled the door shut behind her and turned to face his own cabin, as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time in a long while. It was not a dirty place, exactly. It was a spare place. There was the wide stone fireplace taking up most of the south wall, and the rough-hewn table with one chair pulled up to it, and the narrow bunk along the east wall, and shelves stacked with tins and a few books, and the tools of a man who did everything for himself. There was a second chair, he noticed, pushed against the far wall as though he had placed it there specifically, so that no one would ever be tempted to pull it up to the table. "Sit down," he said, pulling the second chair out and setting it near the fire, because whatever else he might have forgotten about hospitality, he remembered that you did not let a cold and tired person stand. "I will see about your horse." "You don't have to," she began. "The horse needs water and a look at its feet regardless," he said. "Sit." She sat. She set her carpetbag carefully at her feet and her map on her knee and watched the fire, and he pulled on his coat and went out into the darkening evening to find the animal. It was a sturdy bay mare with good lines and the look of a horse that had been well cared for. She was standing calmly at the fence with her left foreleg slightly raised, and Patrick ran his hand down the leg and lifted the foot and looked at the bare hoof in the fading light. Clean break on the shoe. No injury to the hoof wall. He led the mare around to his small barn and gave her water and a portion of grain and left her in the spare stall with clean straw, and the whole time he worked, He was aware of a strange and unsettling feeling moving through his chest that he could not quite name. He had not spoken to anyone in 11 days. Before that, it had been the supply run to Calico Falls, where he exchanged money for goods with the minimum of conversation and drove the wagon home alone. He had lived this way for 3 years, since the spring of 1881, and he had told himself repeatedly that it suited him fine. That solitude was not loneliness if you chose it deliberately. That he had earned the right to close the world out. He went back inside and she was still sitting where he had left her, though she had removed her coat and hung it neatly on the hook beside the door as if she had lived there all her life, which startled him slightly. Her dress beneath was a deep blue, worn but clean, and she had straightened her hair and was holding a small leather-bound book in her lap that she must have taken from her carpetbag. She was reading it with the focused attention of a woman who did not waste moments. "Your mare is fine," he said, moving to the fire and adding another log. "Lost a shoe cleanly. No damage to the hoof. She can travel tomorrow when there is daylight." She looked up from her book. "Tomorrow, I see. The road to Calico Falls in the dark is not safe on foot or on horseback with an unshod hoof," he said. "There are gullies and loose shale on the south stretch and coyotes that have been running bold this season. I was not planning to walk in the dark," she said carefully. "I was planning to borrow your lantern and walk in the light of it." "A lantern carries 2 miles on an open road," he said. "Calico Falls is 7 miles east. You would be in the dark long before you reached it." She absorbed this. She looked at the fire and then at him and then at her book, and he watched the series of small calculations moving across her face as she worked out her situation with the methodical calm of a woman who had been solving problems by herself for a long time. "I have money," she said, finally. "I can pay for the use of your barn floor. You will not sleep in the barn." "Then where?" "The bunk," he said. "I will be fine by the fire." She studied him for a moment with those serious dark eyes, as though she was reading him the way she had been reading her book. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and said, "Thank you, Mr. Keller," he said. "Patrick Keller." "Evelyn Pritchard," she said, and offered her hand across the space between them with the directness of a woman who did not bother with false modesty or unnecessary ceremony. He shook it. Her hand was cold from the walk and smaller than he expected, and the handshake was firm. He let go quickly and turned away to hang his coat. "Are you new to Kansas?" he asked, because the question was less about wanting to know and more about filling the silence before it got uncomfortable, which surprised him, because he had not worried about comfortable silences in 3 years. 3 days new," she said. "I came from Ohio. I have a position waiting for me in Calico Falls. Schoolteacher." He glanced back at her. She was watching him with that same direct, unreadable expression. "School's in Calico Falls," he said. "Since when?" "Since September, apparently. They built the schoolhouse over the summer. I received the letter of appointment in June and have been traveling since August." She paused. "It is a very long way from Ohio." "It is," he said. He put together a meal because she looked like she needed one more than she needed conversation, and he was better at practical things than at talking anymore. He had dried venison and cornmeal and a tin of peaches and strong coffee, and he set it all on the table and pulled his own chair up, and they sat across from each other in the firelight, while the wind picked up outside and moved around the corners of the cabin with increasing authority. She ate with the restrained speed of a person who was very hungry and was trying not to show it, and he pretended not to notice, which was its own kind of courtesy. After a while she set down her fork and said, "How long have you been out here?" 7 years, he said. "Alone?" He looked at her. "The last 3. She did not ask why, which was either good manners or good sense, and he was not sure which, but was grateful either way. She poured herself more coffee from the pot on the fire as naturally as if she were in her own kitchen, and he noticed that she had the kind of ease about her that did not depend on familiarity with a place or a person. She carried her own ease with her wherever she went. "It's good country," she said, looking toward the window where the dark pressed against the glass. "Severe," but good. I could see that even in the failing light, the way the land stretches, the sky is enormous out here. It is, he said again, and then because something was pulling at him in a way he could not explain, he added, it looks different in the morning. The light comes up gold over the eastern ridge and the whole plain changes color, like someone is painting it fresh every day. She looked at him with a small, genuine smile that he felt somewhere entirely unexpected. You sound like a man who has watched it quite a few mornings. 7 years of them, he said. She nodded, and the smile softened into something quieter, and they sat for a while longer with the fire and the coffee and the wind, and it was the least uncomfortable silence Patrick Keller had experienced in a very long time. He woke before dawn with a stiff neck and a banked fire, and the certain, peculiar knowledge that there was another person sleeping in his cabin. He lay still for a moment, adjusting to it the way you adjust to a new sound in a landscape you thought you knew completely. Then he rose quietly and rebuilt the fire and put coffee on and went out to check on the bay mare, who was content and well rested in the stall, eating placidly from the hay net he had hung the night before. The morning was exactly as he had described it to Evelyn Pritchard. The eastern ridge caught the first light and held it in long gold bars that spread across the flat plain and set the dry autumn grass shimmering. A meadowlark was singing somewhere near the creek, and the air had the clean, cold bite of approaching winter, and Patrick stood in it for a few minutes just breathing, which was something he had gotten out of the habit of doing, simply standing still in the beauty of a thing without immediately moving on to the next necessary task. When he went back inside, she was awake. She was sitting at the table with her book and her coffee, already dressed, her hair pinned up with the neat practicality he was coming to recognize as characteristic of her, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Good morning," as if they did this every day, which did something peculiar to his chest all over again. "Good morning," he said. "I need to ride into Calico Falls for supplies in any case. I can take your mare on a lead and see you into town." She closed her book and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You were planning a supply run today?" "No," he said honestly, "but I am due for one." She held his gaze for a moment. "You did not have to do that." "I know." She nodded slowly as though she accepted this without needing it explained further and went back to her book while he made breakfast. The ride to Calico Falls took them through country that Patrick had traveled so many times alone that he had stopped really seeing it. Having someone beside him changed that in a way that was deeply inconvenient to acknowledge. The wide, tawny autumn plain, the line of cottonwoods burning yellow along Dry Creek, the red rock outcroppings on the south ridge standing against a sky so blue it looked painted. He found himself wanting to point things out, to say, "Look at that," which was not something he had wanted to do in a very long time. Evelyn rode the bay mare with the easy confidence of a woman who had spent time in the saddle, which surprised him given that she had come from Ohio. He was riding his own horse, a tall gray quarter horse named Moss, and they kept pace with each other naturally on the wide road without discussion. She asked questions about the land and about the town ahead with the same direct practicality she seemed to apply to everything, and he answered them, and it was. He searched for the word and landed on it with some surprise. Pleasant. He had forgotten that conversation could be pleasant. Calico Falls was a genuine town by Western Kansas standards in 1884, which meant it had 200 and some residents, a proper main street with a hardware store, a general store run by a man named Abernathy, a doctor's office, a small hotel called the Frontier House, a blacksmith named Delgado who was the best farrier in 3 counties, the new schoolhouse at the eastern end of town, and a saloon called the Lucky Strike that Patrick had not set foot in since 1881. There was also a sheriff's office presided over by a man named Bill Caulfield, who was broadly competent and occasionally exhausting. Evelyn took in the main street with an assessing eye as they rode in, the way someone takes stock of a new situation before deciding how to operate within it. He watched her watching the town and felt an inexplicable small proprietary pride in it, as if it reflected on him personally, which was absurd since he lived 7 miles outside of it and barely came in. He took her first to Delgado's smithy, where the farrier had the mare rishad within the hour with the easy efficiency of a man who was very good at his work. While they waited, Evelyn stood at the open door of the forge and watched the process with genuine interest, asking Delgado intelligent questions about the shoe weight and the mare's gait, and Delgado, who was a quiet man generally, answered with evident pleasure at someone paying real attention to his craft. Patrick leaned against the wall and watched her. He could not seem to stop watching her, which was something he needed to examine and had not yet made time to do. After the smithy, she asked if he would show her where the schoolhouse was, and he walked her down the east end of Main Street to the new building. It was modest but solid whitewashed plank siding, a small porch, 6 real glass windows that would be a genuine luxury when winter came, and a bell mounted above the door that was clearly brand new and had not yet been rung for any class. She walked up the porch steps and put her hand on the door, and it opened, unlocked, and she stepped inside and he followed without entirely intending to. The schoolroom was bare and waiting, 12 desks in rough rows, a blackboard along the front wall, a cast-iron stove in the corner for the winter, tall shelves along the back that were currently empty. Afternoon sunlight came in golden through those glass windows and fell across the dusty floorboards in long, warm rectangles. Evelyn stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at everything, and the expression on her face was one he could not quite categorize, something between determination and wonder, as though she was already seeing what this room could become rather than what it currently was. 32 children enrolled, she said. That is what the letter said. From the town and the surrounding ranches and homesteads, children who have been without schooling for years in some cases. There are families out here who have been here since before the town, Patrick said. Children growing up without much access to education. She turned and looked at him. Children like you were, perhaps. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally, like I was. My mother taught me to read, but there was no school for 50 miles. She nodded. That is why I came, she said simply. Not because western Kansas was my dream location, but because there were 32 children who needed someone to come. He stood in the schoolhouse light and looked at this woman who had walked 2 miles through failing dark, rather than leave a horse alone with an unshod hoof, who had slept on a stranger's bunk with the matter-of-fact courage of someone accustomed to managing her own way in difficult circumstances. And he felt something that he had spent 3 years carefully not feeling begin to move in him like a river coming back after a long dry season. He had very good reasons for closing himself away. He reminded himself of them now, standing in the afternoon light of that empty schoolhouse. Clara had been dead 3 years. She had been his wife for 2 years and dead for 3, taken by the fever that swept through the southern farms in the spring of 1881. And the grief of it had been a thing he could not carry in an ordinary world. He had needed the silence and the distance, and the solitude the way a wounded animal needs a quiet place, and he did not apologize for that even to himself. But he had not meant it to be permanent. He had just kept not being ready to let it end, one season at a time, until 3 years had passed, and the solitude had become the shape of his life, rather than a temporary retreat from pain. He had not told Evelyn Pritchard any of this. He had told her nothing personal at all, and she had not asked. And now she was standing in her new schoolroom with that warm light on her face and that expression of steady, purposeful love for a job that needed doing, and something in Patrick Keller cracked open quietly and without fanfare, the way ice cracks on a river in March, not all at once, but inexorably, the structural integrity of a long cold season beginning to give way. They went to Abernathy's general store, where he got his supplies, and where Evelyn spent 30 minutes going through the school supply catalog with Abernathy's wife, Martha, who turned out to know everyone in a 50-mile radius, and was delighted by Evelyn in the way that certain warm-hearted people are immediately and completely delighted by other warm-hearted people. By the time they left, Evelyn had been invited to Sunday supper at the Abernathy house and had already learned the names of 14 of her future students. She had also arranged lodging at the Frontier house for the coming weeks until she could find something more permanent, paid for it in advance with a small leather purse she kept in her coat pocket, and arranged with the hotel owner to have her trunk brought from the Calico Falls freight office, where it had been sitting since she had left it there on her arrival 3 days ago. She did all of this with the brisk, organized competence of a woman who knew exactly how to set herself up in a new place and did not require help, but who accepted it gracefully when it was offered. Patrick loaded his supplies into his wagon, and when everything was done and settled and Evelyn's mare was tied at the Frontier house rail and her trunk was being carried up to her room, he stood in the main street of Calico Falls with his hat in his hands and understood that he had to leave and could not quite make himself do it. "Thank you," she said, coming to stand beside him, "for the shelter and the breakfast and the company on the road. I would have managed without you, but it was considerably more pleasant with you." "You're welcome," he said. He turned the hat in his hands. "The school opens Monday." "Monday," she confirmed. "If you need anything from the direction of Dry Creek," he began and then stopped himself because what was he offering exactly? He was a man who had closed his door to the world for 3 years. She looked at him with those level dark eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The road out to your homestead. Does it pass by the Henderson Ranch? I was told the Henderson children are enrolled." "It does. 3 miles south of me, then east." She nodded. "Perhaps I will ride that way on a Saturday sometime, to call on the families." He put his hat back on. "It's good country for riding," he said. "So you have said," she answered, and there was something in her voice, quiet and warm, like the distant beginning of a smile. He drove back to his homestead in the late afternoon light with his supplies and his horse, and the particular unsteady feeling of a man who has just experienced the beginning of something he does not have a name for yet. The first Saturday in October she came riding down the Calico Road past his fence line in the blue afternoon, and he was splitting wood in the side yard and saw her from 50 feet away. She raised one hand in a casual greeting as she passed, and he raised his in return, and that was all. She was riding out to the Henderson place. He went back to his wood splitting, but he stood up straighter than he had been standing before, and he worked at a slightly better pace, and the afternoon seemed there was no rational explanation for it slightly more golden than it had been. She stopped on her way back about an hour before sundown. She pulled up at his fence and said, "The Henderson children are wonderful. The eldest is 12 and has been helping the younger ones with reading. She has a natural gift for it." He walked to the fence. "Martha Henderson was a schoolteacher herself before she came out west," he said. "Kept the children up with their letters on her own." "That explains it," Evelyn said, and she was smiling fully now, the kind of smile that rearranged her whole face into something that made it difficult to look at directly and also impossible to look away from. "Will you be in town this week? Abernathy mentioned he was expecting the new plow equipment. Thursday, likely." "I will be at the school Thursday afternoon if you wanted to see." She stopped herself and laughed once, quietly, as if she had surprised herself. "I was going to say if you wanted to see how it looks now that I have set it up, but that is a very odd thing to invite someone to." "It is not odd," he said before he could stop himself. "I would like to see it." She looked at him with that considering expression, the one that made him feel gently and thoroughly assessed. Then she said, "Thursday afternoon, then, after 2. She rode away up the Calico Road, and he stood at his fence watching her go for longer than was strictly necessary, and the cottonwoods along Dry Creek had gone entirely gold in the October light, and the sky above them was the kind of deep clear blue that Kansas did better than anywhere else in the world. On Thursday he was at the schoolhouse at 2:15, which was the closest to prompt he could manage, and she was standing at the blackboard with a piece of chalk in her hand, and turned when he came in with that same unself-conscious ease she had shown on his porch and at his table and in the smithy doorway. The room had been transformed. Not extravagantly, because she did not have the resources for extravagance, but thoroughly. The desks had been arranged in a careful semicircle rather than straight rows, which he thought was interesting. The shelves held neatly organized books, her own, he guessed, from the way they were worn-in slates for each student and a small globe on the top shelf that must have traveled all the way from Ohio in her trunk. The blackboard had a sentence written on it in her clear, strong hand. "Learning is how we build the world we want to live in." "I know it is perhaps ambitious for a first week," she said, following his gaze to the board, "but I would rather set the bar high and meet them in the middle than start low and have no room to rise." "It's a good sentence," he said. "It is what my own teacher told me when I was 9, she said. I have never forgotten it." He walked slowly around the room, looking at the details, and she talked about her students, their names, what she had already learned about them in the first week. The 2 boys who sat in the back and were clearly planning mischief, but were also, she suspected, the 2 most intellectually hungry children in the room. The Henderson girl, whose name was Josephine and who read at a level 2 years beyond her age. The small boy named Peter Caulfield, who was the sheriff's youngest and who had come on the first day unable to write his own name, and had left at the end of the day having written it 15 times on his slate with the fierce, concentrated joy of a child who has just discovered a superpower. Patrick sat in one of the student desks, which was slightly too small for him, and made his knees angle upward at an awkward angle, and listened to her talk. He had forgotten what it was like to listen to someone speak with genuine, uncomplicated passion about a thing they loved doing. It was warming was the word, like standing near a fire after a long time in the cold. "I am talking too much," she said suddenly, laughing at herself. "I do this. Tell me something about your work." "Cattle and horses," he said, "and some crops, corn and winter wheat. It is not as interesting as 32 children." "Tell me about the horses," she said, sitting down at her own desk at the front of the room and leaning her chin on her hand with the focused interest that seemed to be her natural mode of engagement with everything. "You clearly know them, the way you handled my mare." So he talked about horses. About the quarter horses he had bred for the past 5 years and their temperaments, their bloodlines, the way a good horse learned to read its rider, the way a good reader learns to read a book, filling in the spaces, anticipating, understanding the weight behind the words. He talked about Moss, the gray horse, who had been with him for 6 years and knew his moods better than any person he had ever met. He talked about the country itself, the way the horses moved through it differently in different seasons, the way they read the wind for weather, the way he read the sky. She listened without interrupting, and when he finally ran down and looked up, he realized he had been talking for 20 minutes, which was approximately 18 minutes more than his usual conversation output, and she was looking at him with an expression that was soft and warm and utterly without calculation. "You love it," she said, "the land and the animals and the quiet of it, genuinely." "Yes," he said. "And yet you are very good company," she said. Which is an interesting combination in a man who clearly chooses solitude. He was quiet for a moment. "I did choose it," he said, 3 years ago." She waited, and he understood that she was giving him the space to continue or not, entirely at his own choice, without pressure or expectation. It was one of the most considerate things anyone had done for him in a long time. "My wife died," he said, "in the spring of 1881. We had been married 2 years. The schoolroom held the words gently. Outside, a jay was scolding something in the oak tree at the corner of the building, and the afternoon light came through the glass windows in those warm rectangles he remembered from the first day. "I am sorry," Evelyn said, and the words were simple and direct, and not ornamented with sympathy he did not want, which was exactly right. "What was her name?" "Clara," she nodded. "And you closed your door?" "Yes. Because the world was too loud after that," she said, not as a question but as an understanding. He looked at her. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the blackboard, at that sentence about learning and building worlds. Then she said, I have never lost a husband, so I cannot claim to know exactly what that is. But I lost my father when I was 22 and my mother 6 months later, one right behind the other, and I understand something about the way grief changes the sound of everything, makes ordinary noise seem very far away and also too close. Yes, he said, and the single word held more relief in it than he had expected, the relief of being precisely understood. I was 24 when my mother died, she said. I am 26 now. I came west partly because Ohio still felt very loud in all the wrong ways. He did the calculation without meaning to and then stopped himself. 26, he was 31. It gets quieter, he said, after a while. Does it? She asked, looking at him. The grief does, he said carefully. The quiet itself you have to choose again, whether to let it end. She looked at him for a long moment, and he felt that assessment again, that gentle and thorough reading, and then she said, I think perhaps you are beginning to make that choice. He could not argue with her, so he did not try. October deepened into November, and the visits became a pattern without either of them quite deciding to make them so. On Saturdays, she rode out to the Henderson place or the Briggs farm or any of the outlying families with children in her school, and she always stopped at his fence on the way back, and they talked. About her students, about his horses, about the land, about the books they had each been reading. She read everything she could get her hands on, which in western Kansas in 1884 was not as much as she would have liked. And so they began trading books through the fence, her lending him things from her traveling library and him lending her the volumes that had accumulated on his shelves over years of ordering from the Abernathy catalog. He read a novel about the sea that she had loved and found himself reading it with her invisible presence beside him, wondering what she would say about the passages he found most striking. He began to mark them with slips of paper so he could find them again when he told her. She came to his fence one Saturday afternoon in mid-November with ice on the puddles and her breath making small clouds in the air and said, I have found a room to rent from Martha Abernathy above the dry goods store. It is small but warm and she is good company. I wanted you to know. That is better than the hotel, he said, considerably. She paused and something shifted in her expression, something that became more careful without becoming less warm. I also wanted to ask you something. He waited. I'm going to need someone to help me carry materials out to the Henderson children for the Christmas program, she said. There are costumes and backdrops and a rather unwieldy wooden star that Peter Caulfield has insisted on constructing and which I cannot fit in my saddlebag. I was wondering if you would consider driving your wagon. He looked at her. She looked back at him with perfect steadiness. Saturday before Christmas, he said. Saturday before Christmas, she confirmed. All right, he said. What he did not say was that he had already been thinking about Christmas. That it was the first year in 3 that the approach of December did not simply feel like another wall of cold and silence to get through. That some part of him, the part that had cracked open quietly in that schoolhouse in October, was already imagining the lit windows of the Henderson house and children's voices and Evelyn in her dark blue dress, moving through it all with her organized, purposeful warmth, and he wanted to be there. Not as the solitary man who lived 7 miles from everything, but as someone who was present in his own life again. The Henderson Christmas program was, by any measure, a tremendous success. 12 children performed a nativity scene that Martha Henderson had spent 4 evenings helping to prepare, and Josephine Henderson read a passage from the Bible with the clear, sure voice of a girl who knew her own strength. Young Peter Caulfield's wooden star was hung above the small stage area by a cord from the rafters and spun slowly in the warm air from the fireplace, catching the lamplight and throwing small golden shapes across the walls, and every adult in the room watched it with the particular soft expression that comes over people when a child has made something beautiful for the first time. Patrick sat in the back of the room with his hat on his knee and watched Evelyn. She sat to one side, near the back, and she was not performing or managing. She was simply watching her students with a love on her face so clear, and uncomplicated that it made the room brighter, and she did not notice him watching her because she was entirely absorbed in the people in front of her. Afterward, there was coffee and 3 different pies that the Henderson and Briggs women had contributed, and Patrick found himself in conversation with Jim Henderson about winter grazing and the fence line on the South Ridge. And it was the most naturally social he had been in 3 years, and it did not feel like a performance or an effort. It simply felt like an evening among people, and he was surprised to find that he had missed it. On the wagon ride back toward town in the late evening, with the sky enormous and black and blazing with winter stars above them, Evelyn said, "Thank you for the wagon, and for staying." "I am glad I stayed," he said. It was a simple sentence, but it cost him something to say it, in the way that simple, honest things often do, and she seemed to understand that. "Peter Caulfield worked on that star for 2 weeks," she said. "He came in early every morning and worked on it by himself before the other students arrived. He wanted it to be a surprise." "It was a good star," Patrick said. "It was a magnificent star," she said firmly, and he laughed quietly in the dark, and she turned to look at him with that expression again, the warm and careful one, and then she said, "That is the first time I have heard you laugh." "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been looking forward to it." He drove her to the Abernathy dry goods store and helped her down from the wagon seat. And when she was standing on the ground in front of him with the cold air between them and the lamplight from the store window touching the side of her face, he was aware of being very close to the edge of something. The particular edge where a long habit of solitude and a newly reawakened willingness to be present in the world meet each other and have to work out between them which one will govern a man's choices going forward. "Evelyn," he said, and her name in his own voice sounded strange and right at the same time. She tilted her head slightly and waited. "I am not," he began, and stopped, and started again. "I have been away from people for a long time. I am not entirely certain I remember how to," he stopped again. "How to be someone's person," she said quietly, without mockery. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight shifted in the cold wind. Somewhere up the main street a door opened and shut and someone's boots went crunching on frozen ground. "I am not in a hurry," she said, "and I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. But I think you should know that I enjoy your company very much and I am glad you knocked on my door." He blinked. "You knocked on my door." "Did I?" she said, and there was the smile again, the full one, the one that rearranged her whole face. "I may have that backwards." He was still thinking about what she had said when he drove home through the winter dark with the stars blazing overhead, and he was thinking about it when he fed Moss and latched the barn and went inside to his fire, and he thought about it until he fell asleep. He had not opened his door to anyone in 3 years. She had knocked and he had answered before he could stop himself, and now here he was, alive in a way he had almost forgotten he was supposed to be. December moved through the homestead with its cold, and its beauty, and its long, clear nights. He repaired the south fence and winterized the water troughs and spent 3 evenings making careful notes on the breeding plans for spring, but all of it he did with a different quality of attention than he had brought to anything in the past 3 years. He was no longer simply filling time. He was planning forward, the way a person does when they believe that the time ahead of them contains something worth planning for. He rode into Calico Falls on a Tuesday in mid-December with no specific errand requiring it, which he recognized as significant. He told himself he needed nails. He needed some nails. He went to Abernathy's and got the nails, and then, because he was already in town, he went to the school. She was at her desk with a stack of papers when he knocked on the open door, and she looked up and said, "Patrick," with the natural, easy pleasure of someone saying a name they are glad to have reason to say. He came in and sat in his usual student desk, knees at the wrong angle, and she set aside her papers, and they talked for an hour about nothing in particular and everything in general. About the winter coming on hard, about a book she had just finished and the one she was planning to start, about young Peter Caulfield, who had now written 4 separate poems on his slate, each one about a different animal, each one more imaginative than the last. About the spring and what it would look like on the plain and whether the Henderson family's new colt would have its dam's good temperament. When he left, he said, "I will be in town Thursday for supplies," which was true. She said, "I have papers to grade Thursday, but I will be done by 4, which was information. He nodded and walked out into the December afternoon, and the cold was bracing and good, and he felt, for the first time in 3 years, genuinely glad to be himself and in his own life. Christmas Day itself he spent quietly, as he had the last 3. But for the first time in those 3 years, he was not spending it alone in the way that grinds. He was spending it alone in the way a man spends a quiet morning before heading into the rest of his day. He cooked himself a proper meal and read by the fire, and in the afternoon saddled Moss and rode the long way around the South Ridge just to move through the country, and it was beautiful and cold, and he was content. She had left a package at the Abernathy store for him before the holiday, which Martha Abernathy had passed along with raised eyebrows and a smile that said several things at once. It contained a book poetry by a man named Walt Whitman and a small card in her clear, strong handwriting that said, "For the man who paints the morning in gold. Happy Christmas, Evelyn." He read the Whitman that evening by his fire and thought that she had chosen correctly. January was fierce. The storms that rolled through the southern Kansas plain in January of 1885 were some of the worst in recent memory. 3 blizzards in the span of 4 weeks, drifts up to the windowsills, temperatures that dropped below what a thermometer nailed to a barn door could measure. Patrick stayed close to the homestead, tending his animals and his fire and his book supply, and did not see Evelyn for the better part of 3 weeks, and he was genuinely surprised by how much he minded the absence. He wrote to her. He had not written a personal letter in 3 years, and his first attempt was stiff and awkward in the way that letters become when the writer is out of the habit of addressing anyone directly. He burned that one. The second was better. It was about the storms and the livestock, and what the South Ridge looked like under 4 feet of snow, which was something he thought she would want to know. He mentioned that he had finished the Whitman and underlined 7 passages that seemed particularly important, and would she like the book back so she could see which ones. He rode into town between the 2nd and 3rd blizzard to leave it at the Abernathy store. Her reply came 3 days later, delivered by young Billy Abernathy on horseback, in a sealed letter with his name on the front in her handwriting. She said the storms had kept the school closed for a week, but that she had used the time to plan the spring curriculum and also to bake 3 different kinds of bread, one of which had been a complete disaster, the details of which she would tell him when she could see his face because she needed to see if he was going to laugh. She said the passages he had underlined were the same ones she would have underlined, which she considered significant. She said she missed the fence conversations and hoped the cattle were all right and was his wood supply holding. He read the letter 4 times before breakfast. His wood supply was holding. He cut more anyway. When the 3rd blizzard broke in the last week of January and the road was passable again, he was in Calico Falls within 2 days, and when he walked into the school at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, Evelyn looked up from her desk and said, "The bread disaster," and then described, with considerable dramatic flair, the incident with the sourdough starter that had expanded beyond the bowl overnight and made its determined way across the kitchen shelf, and he laughed, really laughed, the full, unguarded kind, and she sat back and watched him laugh with the expression of someone who has been looking forward to exactly this for 3 weeks. They walked through town afterward because the air was cold but clear, and the sky was doing something extraordinary over the western plain, a long band of rose and orange above the flat horizon. She walked beside him, and their breath made small white clouds in the cold air, and their steps were matched without effort, and it felt, Patrick thought, entirely natural, which was the most extraordinary thing about it. At the corner of Main Street and 2nd, she turned toward the Abernathy store and her rented rooms, and he stopped walking, and she stopped too, and he looked at her in the fading rose light and said what he had been working toward since January and quite possibly since October. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "If you are willing." She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, "I am." It was the simplest thing. 2 words, and the long solitary winter of the previous 3 years shifted on its axis and became something else, a finished season rather than a permanent condition. He called on her properly after that. Sunday afternoons at the Abernathy house, which Martha Abernathy facilitated with gleeful warmth by always finding something to do in the back of the store when they sat together in the front parlor. Tuesday evenings when she did not have papers to grade. Occasionally Saturday mornings when he would drive the wagon into town and they would do the week's errands together and then sit together at the hotel dining room. The best eating in Calico Falls, which was admittedly not saying much, and have coffee, and whatever Martha Henderson had contributed to the menu that week. He learned things about her in the layered, gradual way you learn things about someone when you are paying real attention. She was the oldest of 3 children and had raised her younger sisters largely on her own after her parents died. She had been engaged once to a young man in Columbus, Ohio, who had been perfectly pleasant and entirely wrong for her, and they had parted by mutual and honest agreement before either of them was harmed by it. She read everything but loved poetry best. She had a complete and total inability to tolerate injustice of any kind, which expressed itself not in rage but in a calm, determined, absolutely immovable practical action. She had already spoken with Sheriff Caulfield about the conditions for the 2 Apache families who had settled near the southern edge of the county, who had been refused service at the general store by Abernathy's competitor, a man named Voss who ran a dry goods operation on the western end of Main Street. And she had made it quietly and clearly known that she considered this unacceptable, and that the children of those families were welcome in her school on equal terms with every other child in the county. Voss had grumbled. She had not changed her position by a single degree. Patrick had known about those families, had known about Voss, had done nothing about it because he had been doing nothing about anything for 3 years. He went to see Sheriff Caulfield himself after that, and between the 2 of them and a conversation that Patrick was fairly certain Evelyn did not know about, they made it clear that Voss's practice was going to create problems for him if it continued, and it did not continue. He told her about Clara. Not all at once and not in a single sitting, but in pieces over many evenings, the way you dismantle something that has been standing for a long time carefully, with attention to what holds what. He told her about meeting Clara Marsh at a barn dance outside Dodge City in 1878, and about marrying her the following spring, and about the 2 years they had, which had been genuinely good. He told her about the fever of 1881, how fast it moved, how little time there had been to prepare. He told her about burying her on the rise behind the homestead, where she had loved to sit and watch the morning come. He told her that he had not talked about Clara to anyone since the funeral, which was true, and that saying these things aloud felt like setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was separate from him. Evelyn listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, complete, warm, and without any attempt to fix or diminish. When he finished speaking on an evening in late February, with the fire going strong against the cold outside and the parlor of the Abernathy house quiet around them, she said, "She sounds like she was a person worth loving." "She was," he said. "And you loved her well," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I tried to." "Trying well is the same as doing well," she said. "For most things that matter." He looked at her. The firelight was warm on her face and her hands were folded in her lap with her particular composed stillness, and he thought, not for the first time, that whatever he had opened his door to that October evening, it was not merely inconvenient. It was the best thing that had come to him in a very long time, perhaps in his life. February gave way to March, And March came in with the dramatic tension of a season that cannot quite decide what it wants to be. Cold mornings that gave way to afternoons where you could stand in the sun without a coat and believe, genuinely believe, that the warmth of the world was returning. The grass along Dry Creek started coming up green at the roots before the old dead blades had even blown away, and the cottonwoods along the creek were budding, small and tight and gold green at the tips of every branch. He took her to see the morning light over the eastern ridge on the first warm Saturday in March, which required her to be at his homestead at 6 in the morning, which required him to ride into town the evening before and back at first light after collecting her at the Abernathy door, which he did without complaint, and she received with the practical cheerfulness of a person who does not mind early rising. They stood on the rise behind his homestead, the rise where Clara was buried, though he had not mentioned this to Evelyn, and watched the light come up over the ridge the way he had described it to her that first evening. The long gold bars, the plain changing color, the meadowlark. The smell of the cold air warming by degrees as the sun lifted. She was standing beside him and did not speak, which was correct, because this was not a thing that needed words, and she understood that. She simply stood and watched, and he watched her watching, and the morning was entirely, perfectly itself. After a while she said, very quietly, "You were right. Someone does paint it fresh every day." "Yes," he said. He had brought Clara's marker with him to the rise, a plain carved stone he had set himself, and she saw it after a moment and looked at it and then at him. "This is where she is," she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought you should see it, if we are." He paused. "If this is what I think it is." She turned and looked at him fully. "What do you think it is?" He took a breath. "I think I am falling in love with you," he said, "and I think that is terrifying and right in equal measure, and I have not known what to do with it for approximately 4 months." She was very still. The meadowlark sang again from the creek. Then she said, "It is the same for me, exactly the same in both respects." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there on the rise with the morning light growing around them, and Clara's stone quiet in the grass, and the whole enormous sky above them turning from gold to blue, and it was not a sad moment, which was the extraordinary part. It was a full moment, a beginning that did not erase anything that had come before but grew naturally from it, the way spring grows from winter, not by denying the cold but by coming up through it. Spring proper arrived in April, and with it came the kind of fullness that the Kansas plain does particularly well, everything bright and new, and slightly overwhelming after the long white months. The prairie flowers came up in the grass along the road to town, small yellow and purple ones that appeared without warning in the morning and were just there, as if they had always been there, and the winter had simply been keeping them in reserve. Evelyn's school was in its spring term, and she was visibly happy in the way that people are happy when their work is genuinely good and genuinely needed. She had added reading to the curriculum for 3 of the families who had asked, meaning that some of the parents were coming in 2 evenings a week to learn alongside their children, which had not been planned for but which she had organized with the easy warmth of someone who saw a need and filled it without waiting for permission. Sheriff Caulfield's youngest, Peter, was now reading at grade level, which Evelyn considered one of her finest professional achievements, and she spoke about it with the same unassuming pride she brought to everything she was good at. Patrick's spring had its own fullness. The breeding plans for his horses were coming along well, and 3 of the mares were due to foal in April, and he had taken on 2 hands for the spring work. A young man named George, who had come out from Missouri looking for work and proved to be a natural with horses, and a quiet older man named Simmons, who did not say much, but could fix anything and drove a fence post better than anyone Patrick had ever worked with. The homestead, which had been a one-man operation for 3 years, was becoming something more like a working ranch. He was aware that this expansion was connected, in a way he could not entirely explain rationally, to Evelyn. Not because she had asked it of him, but because she had reminded him, simply by existing and being the particular person she was, that the world was worth building in. that there was a future to work toward. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in April. He had not planned to do it on a Tuesday. He had planned to do it on a Sunday, with considerably more preparation, possibly involving a ring from the jeweler in the next town over who he had written to in March. But they were sitting in the school after hours, with the late spring evening light coming golden through the windows, and she was describing Peter Caufield's most recent poem about a hawk, which had contained the line, "The sky is where I keep my bravery," which Patrick had asked her to repeat twice, because it seemed to him a remarkably precise 9-year-old observation. And she laughed telling it, the full, unguarded laugh that he had worked all winter to hear regularly, and he looked at her in the golden light and said, without planning it, without the ring or the Sunday or any of the preparation, "Evelyn, I would like to marry you." She stopped laughing. She looked at him. The light was very golden. "That is not a question," she said. "No," he agreed. "Would you marry me?" She tilted her head in the way she did when she was thinking, the slight tilt that meant she was giving something her full, serious attention. Then she said, "I would marry you, Patrick Keller. I would be very glad to." He did get the ring in the end. He rode to the next town, a place called Millhaven, on Thursday, and was back by evening with a small gold ring set with a dark red garnet, which he put on her finger on Friday evening in the parlor of the Abernathy house. And Martha Abernathy cried with the uninhibited joy of a woman who had seen this coming since October and was vastly pleased to be proven right. They were married in June, on a Saturday morning so blue and clear it looked painted, because the Kansas morning always did. The ceremony was at the small white church at the north end of Calico Falls that Patrick had not been inside in 3 years, and the whole town came, because Evelyn had been in Calico Falls for 8 months, and in that time had become the kind of person that an entire town turns out for. The children from her school sat in the front rows, and Peter Caulfield sat up very straight and wore his best shirt and looked, Patrick thought, exactly like a boy who was attending something genuinely important. Martha Abernathy stood with Evelyn as her witness. Jim Henderson stood with Patrick, because they had spent 3 months building a friendship over fence lines and horses and winter plans that had become the kind of straightforward, undemanding male friendship Patrick had forgotten to look for. Sheriff Caulfield performed his official duties at the back of the church and wiped his eyes once, which he denied later. Evelyn wore a dress the color of cream, and her dark hair was pinned up with small white flowers that Martha had gathered that morning from the creek bank, and she came down the church aisle toward him with the composed, warm, unshakable steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about her. And when she reached him and took his hands, she was smiling the full smile, the one that rearranged her whole face, and he thought, yes, this is exactly right. They said their vows simply and clearly, in the way that suited them both, and when it was done, the whole church exhaled together, as if everyone had been holding their breath and could now let it go. The reception was held in the yard behind the Abernathy store, with tables and chairs set out on the grass and food contributed by what seemed like every family in 3 counties, and music provided by a fiddler from the Henderson farm and a harmonica player named Ruiz who played beautifully and with great feeling. Patrick danced. He had not danced in 4 years, since before Clara's illness, and his first few steps with Evelyn in the late afternoon sun were slightly uncertain, and she laughed at him gently and put his hands where they were supposed to be and led him subtly back into the rhythm of it. And then they were dancing properly, in the gold June afternoon, with the whole town around them and the fiddle music carrying out over the open plain. He held her close and said, "I have something to tell you." "What?" She said, her face tilted up toward him. "I am glad you knocked on my door," she laughed, warm and full. "I told you," she said. "I knocked." "You absolutely knocked," he said. They honeymooned, as much as was practical in western Kansas in 1885, by spending 2 weeks at the homestead before the school term ended, and her presence was required, which meant that the homestead became a different kind of place in those 2 weeks, warmer, fuller, more inhabited in every sense than it had been in 3 years or even 7. She brought her trunk from the Abernathy rooms, and the books from her shelves and the small globe from the schoolroom went to her room at the boarding house to wait for September. But everything else came with her, arranged with efficient practicality on the shelves he cleared to make room. In the evenings they sat together by the fire and read or talked or sat in comfortable silence, which was nothing like the heavy, pressured silence of the past 3 years. This was the silence of two people who were at ease in each other's company in a way that does not require constant speech to confirm itself. One evening he took her to the rise behind the homestead again, to Clara's grave, because he felt it was important, and he stood with her there in the summer evening, and told her some more of Clara things he had not told anyone, small particular things, the way she had laughed at her own jokes before the punchline, the way she had named every animal on the property including the chickens, the garden she had started that first spring that still came up with wild tomatoes every year. He told these things carefully and with love and without apology, and Evelyn listened with her hand in his, and when he was done she said, "I am glad she had you, and I am glad you are here." He put his arm around her and they stood until the evening star appeared, and then walked back to the warm house together. Summer moved through the homestead in long, golden days. Evelyn taught through July, because the school did not take a full summer recess. The children's families needed them too much for farm work for a complete term in summer, but she held half-day sessions 3 days a week, and the children came, and she spent her afternoons at the homestead or riding the territory or sitting on the porch in the heat with a book. She was not idle by nature and found ways to be useful in the life of the ranch without stepping on the toes of men who had their own ways of doing things, which was itself a skill. She and George the Hand developed a working friendship based on their shared interest in the horses, and she spent many mornings at the corral watching the mares with their new foals, 3 of which had arrived healthy and strong in the spring, and were now tall, leggy, beautiful creatures learning the world at high speed. She gave them names, which Patrick rolled his eyes at but allowed, because she had excellent instincts for what a horse was like, and the names were invariably accurate. The boldest colt was named Aristotle, which made Jim Henderson, when he came by to see the new stock, laugh so hard he had to sit down. Aristotle was Patrick's favorite of the new foals. He would not have admitted it under mild duress. In August, Evelyn told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning before church, sitting across the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee cup, and a particular quality of stillness around her that he had learned meant she was about to say something she considered significant. He looked at her when she said it. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hands, coffee cup and all, and held them, and what moved through him was the most complex thing he had felt since the years around Clara's illness and death, but opposite in direction. This was not grief moving through him. This was something that had no name in ordinary use, but that expressed itself as gratitude, as wonder, as the profound and slightly frightening recognition that life intended to continue being given to you even when you had done your best to arrange for it to stop. "Are you all right?" he said, which was not what he meant, but the larger things had not yet found words. "I am perfectly all right," she said. "I am very well, actually. Are you?" "Yes," he said. "I am, yes." She squeezed his hands and smiled, and he thought there was nothing in the world as steady as her. The school term started again in September, and Evelyn taught through November, when it became no longer practical. And in November the school was given over to a temporary arrangement with Josephine Henderson, who was now 14 and had been Evelyn's student-teacher assistant, and who managed the younger children with impressive authority, while Evelyn rested at the homestead and wrote lesson plans and read and drove Patrick quietly, but thoroughly to distraction with her calm acceptance of a condition that he found far more alarming than she did. He was not particularly alarmed, he told himself. He was simply aware. of the cold and the fire and the supply of good food and the reliability of Dr. Bennett in Calico Falls, and the distance between the homestead and the doctor's office and the state of the road in December, and whether the gray horse or the bay mare was faster over that particular 7 miles of terrain. He ran these calculations repeatedly. "Stop calculating," Evelyn said one evening from across the fire. She had not looked up from her book. "I am not," he began. "The road is fine, the mare is faster, and Dr. Bennett is perfectly competent," she said, still not looking up. "I have already arranged with Martha Henderson to stay at their place if conditions are bad in December, which is the logical plan, and Jim Henderson can ride into town in half the time you can because he knows the South Cutoff. I have thought it through." He looked at her. She looked up from her book and met his eyes with her level, warm, entirely unruffled gaze. "I have thought everything through," she said. "I always do. That is, in fact, my primary skill." He exhaled. "I know," he said. "Then stop calculating and come read," she said, holding out the book. She had finished another novel from their trading library, a story about the sea that she had found in Millhaven and thought he would like. He came and sat beside her, which was something he had recently started doing on winter evenings rather than sitting across the fire from each other, a shift that had happened gradually and naturally, and that he could not have named the first evening of, but that now seemed simply correct. Her shoulder against his, the fire and the wind outside and the book between them. They had William James Patrick Keller on the 2nd of January, 1886, on a cold, clear morning, with the stars still sharp in the sky when the labor began, and the sun just coming up over the eastern ridge in long gold bars when he arrived, squalling and emphatic, into Dr. Bennett's capable hands in the back room of the Henderson Ranch, where Evelyn had very sensibly gone 3 days before the expected date. Martha Henderson had presided over the whole business with the authority of a woman who had delivered 3 of her own children and assisted with several others, and Patrick had spent most of the night in the Henderson kitchen being plied with coffee by Jim, who said very little but sat up with him in the particular loyal way of a man who understands that sitting up is the entire job on an occasion like this. When they brought the baby out and put him in Patrick's arms, and he looked down at this small, furious, utterly new person with Evelyn's dark hair and his own blue eyes and the red, emphatic face of a child who had opinions from the first moment, he thought several things at once. That life was extraordinary. That grief was real and large, but was not, after all, the last word. That he had come very close to missing all of this. He went in to Evelyn, who was tired and radiant in the particular way of a woman who has just done something enormous, and he sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand, and she looked at the baby and then at him and said, "He has your eyes." "He has your lungs," Patrick said. She laughed, which turned into a wince, and then she was laughing again, soft and tired and full of something that was not quite any single emotion but contained all of them. "William James," she said, confirming the name they had agreed on. William for her father, James for his. "William James," he agreed. William James Keller turned out to have very strong opinions and an excellent disposition, which his mother considered a good combination, and his father considered terrifying and also correct. He was, from the beginning, a child who could make himself comfortable anywhere on the ranch. In the schoolroom when Evelyn went back to teaching in the spring with the baby in a basket in the corner. In the general store where Martha Abernathy held him with proprietary delight every time Evelyn came in for supplies. He reached for things. He watched everything with alert, interested eyes. He was, according to Jim Henderson, going to be trouble in the best possible way. Evelyn went back to teaching in March, which was later than she might have in other circumstances, but earlier than some people thought advisable, and she went back because the children needed her, and because she was Evelyn, which meant she had a very clear sense of when rest had become avoidance and was not interested in the latter. She arranged the school so that Martha Henderson came in 2 mornings a week to watch William James in the back room while Evelyn taught, and the children adopted William James as a sort of small and unofficial class member, taking turns looking in on him during their free period, and reporting back to Mr. and Mrs. Keller on his status and activities. Peter Caulfield, who was now 10, and had written a poem about the hawk and several others about horses, and one startlingly good one about winter that had made Evelyn sit very still when she read it, wrote a poem about William James that contained the line "He is new and small and keeps the whole room aware," which Patrick read later that evening when Evelyn brought it home, and which he thought was, again, precisely right. Spring on the homestead in 1886 was the most lived-in spring it had known since Clara's time, and different from Clara's time in the ways that different from and better than are not the same thing but sometimes point in the same direction. Evelyn's garden came up along the south side of the cabin, not wild tomatoes but planned beds of vegetables and a border of flowers she had started from seed indoors in February and set out when the frost broke. The kitchen had the smell of real cooking most evenings. The fire was built by 2 people rather than 1 and therefore seemed warmer, which was not scientifically logical but was, Patrick had decided, experientially true. George and Simmons were back for the spring work, and the ranch had 3 more foals in April, including a gray colt who was going to be a remarkable horse in 2 years, and whom Evelyn named Copernicus on the grounds that he looked like he was trying to understand how the world worked. Patrick did not even argue. Summer came around again, the second summer of their marriage, and it was different from the first in the small particular ways that a shared life accumulates differences. More of their own history in the rooms, more of their own jokes in the conversations, more of the layered understanding that comes from having been through a winter together, a spring, a child, a season of learning each other's habits and preferences and silences and enthusiasms. William James turned into a small person who had things to say. He was walking by 11 months, which Dr. Bennett said was early, and talking by 13 months, though talking was perhaps generous. He had emphatic sounds for everything and a word for his father and a word for his mother and a word for Moss the gray horse, which was his first and most frequent vocabulary item, which Patrick found gratifying. In September of 1887, Patrick rode over to the Henderson place to help Jim with the fall fencing, and came home in the evening to find Evelyn sitting on the porch steps with William James on her lap, and a particular quality of stillness around her that he recognized now. He came up the porch steps and looked at her. She looked up at him with the warm, level gaze. "We will need to think about an addition to the south side of the house," she said. He sat down beside her on the steps. "When?" "April," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and William James, who was nearly 2 and had very decided views about everything, said the word for horse with the insistent urgency he brought to all important topics, pointing at the corral where Moss was visible in the evening light. "Yes," Patrick said to his son. "Horse." "Os," said William James. "Os. He is going to be a horseman," Patrick said. "He is going to be everything," Evelyn said, and he knew she meant William James and also the baby coming and also the life they were building, all of it together, the whole continuous project of it. He built the addition to the south side of the house through the fall and winter, with help from George and Simmons and 2 long weekends with Jim Henderson, who was better with timber than anyone Patrick knew. He built it carefully and well, the way he did everything that mattered, with attention to the details and the long view both. It was done by February and ready well before April. Their daughter arrived on the 12th of April, 1888, on a morning of surprising warmth that came in ahead of its season. They named her Clara Rose. Rose was Evelyn's grandmother's name. Clara was Clara. Evelyn had suggested it on a quiet evening in January, without prelude, sitting by the fire with her knitting on her lap, and Patrick had looked at her for a long moment and understood that she was not making a complicated gesture but a simple and generous one, the way she did most things without ceremony, with full intention. "Clara Rose," he had said. Yes, Clara Rose was nothing like her brother in temperament and exactly like him in health and volume. Where William James was bold and forward and grabbed at the world with both hands from the beginning, Clara Rose was observant, taking everything in with Evelyn serious, assessing dark eyes before choosing her response. She was a calm baby and a calm small child, which Evelyn said meant she was processing everything and storing it up, and which Patrick suspected meant she was already more intelligent than anyone in the room, including her mother. William James, at 2.5, received his sister with the magnanimous authority of a very small person who has been prepared for an addition to the household and has decided to allow it. He sat beside Evelyn on the bed and looked at the baby with a serious, evaluating expression and then said, "Os," with what could only be interpreted as a suggestion for the baby's first word. "She will get there," Patrick told him. Life settled into the full, complicated, beautiful pattern of a family in a place that fits them. The school continued, and Evelyn's enrollment grew as new families came to the territory and the county expanded. And by 1889 she had 39 students and had written to the county board about the need for a second classroom. The county board was slow, as boards tended to be, but she was patient, as she tended to be, and persistent, as she absolutely was. The ranch grew. Patrick sold horses up and down the territory and had a reputation, 3 years after expanding the operation, for quarter horses with good minds and good bone, and the kind of working temperament that the western land required. George was the full-time head hand now, and had brought in 2 more men for the spring and fall work, and the homestead that had been a one-man solitary operation was a functioning piece of the county's working economy. In the summer of 1889, Kansas was about to become what it had been working toward, a properly organized, fully admitted part of the United States. The politics of statehood had been grinding through the machinery for years, and while the formal admission had already happened in 1861, the changes to the territory's organization in the years since meant constant adjustments to how things worked. Patrick had developed, over the years of his marriage, an interest in local governance that surprised him. Evelyn had a habit of bringing him along to county meetings, initially because she needed someone to drive, but increasingly because she valued his perspective on things, and he had thoughts he did not know he had until she created the circumstances in which he could have them. She was, he reflected on one such evening, driving back from a county meeting in Millhaven under a wide, star-filled sky, the most effective person he had ever met. Not in a calculated way, but in the way of someone whose values are so clear, and whose intelligence is so applied that the world tends to organize itself in the direction she points. "What are you thinking?" she asked. She was holding Clara Rose, who had fallen asleep on the seat between them, and William James was asleep in the wagon bed with a blanket. "That I am glad you knocked on my door," he said. She looked at him with a smile. "Still, always," he said. She leaned against his shoulder the way she did when they were in the wagon together. Clara Rose warm between them, and the stars moved overhead the way they always did, enormous and uncountable and present, and the horse's moss on the left, because he was still Patrick's horse even at 9 years old, and did not make room for argument, moved through the dark with the easy, knowing pace of animals that understand the road home. By 1890, the ranch had its own name, painted on a board at the gate by Jim Henderson's eldest boy, who had turned out to be a remarkable sign painter, Dry Creek Ranch. It was not a dramatic name, but it was true, and they had always preferred truth over drama. The board was there for anyone coming up the road to see, which meant that the homestead that had been invisible to the world for 3 years was now marked, named, and open in the way that places are open when they belong to people who want to be found. The school got its second classroom in the spring of 1890. Evelyn hired the new teacher herself, a young woman from Missouri named Alice Dyer, 22 years old, small and precise and passionate about mathematics, who arrived in Calico Falls in August with her own library, and who took to Evelyn with the instant, uncomplicated admiration of a person recognizing a model for how to be in their profession. Evelyn treated her with the warm and unpatronizing encouragement of someone who remembered exactly what it was like to be new to a strange place with a job that needed doing. On the evening Alice Dyer arrived and had her supper at the Abernathy house, and met most of the town in the way that arrivals in Calico Falls tended to meet most of the town. Patrick and Evelyn drove home together in the September dark, and he said, "She is very like you were." "She is better than I was," Evelyn said immediately. "Her mathematics are extraordinary. I never had her gift for numbers." "She does not have your instincts for people," he said. Evelyn considered this. "She will develop them," she said. "That comes with time." "Most things do," he said. She looked at him in the dark of the wagon, the way she did sometimes when he said something that she found worth looking at. Then she put her hand over his on the reins and left it there, which was the kind of small thing that had accumulated between them over 5 years of marriage into something that was not small at all. William James, by the fall of 1890, was 4 and had decided to become a horseman, which surprised absolutely no one. He followed George around the corral with an attentive seriousness that made the cowhands laugh, not unkindly, but with the affection of men watching a small person who is absolutely certain about something and might be right. Patrick taught him to sit in the saddle on a very quiet old mare named Saturday, who was past her working years, but wonderfully suited to carrying small, determined people. And he sat up straight with his father's hand steadying him, and watched the ranch unfold around him from this new height with an expression of profound, rapturous satisfaction. Clara Rose, at 2.5, watched all of this from her position on the porch steps or the fence rail, and stored it up with her characteristic quiet assessment. She had developed a vocabulary that was both precise and vivid, which her teacher mother considered the most promising sign of all. She had also developed, at some point in her second year, a habit of asking why to everything, without the challenging edge that the word sometimes carries in small children, but with genuine and earnest curiosity, and the household's policy was to answer her always, as accurately and honestly as they could. Patrick answered her questions about the horses and the land and the weather and the sky with the same careful honesty he had brought to the conversation on the rise above Clara's grave, and he noticed that she listened the way her mother listened, completely, warmly, storing things up for later use. One evening in October of 1890, with the first cold of fall coming in and the cottonwoods along Dry Creek gone entirely gold, Patrick was sitting on the porch after supper. Evelyn was inside putting the children to bed, and he could hear her voice through the window one of the poems she read them at bedtime, something from the Whitman, the children choosing poems now as their bedtime books rather than stories, which was entirely Evelyn's doing. He sat in the cool evening air and listened to her voice, and looked out at the gold cottonwoods and the darkening plain and the first stars appearing in the east. And he thought about everything that had happened since one October evening 6 years ago, when a knock came at the door, and his hand had been on the latch before he could think clearly enough to make a different choice. He thought about the solitude and what it had been and what it was not anymore. He thought about Clara, whose grave on the rise was tended carefully and visited sometimes, and who was part of this place, and this life in the way that the past is always part of the present when you love it honestly instead of pretending it was not there. He thought about William James on the horse and Clara Rose's questions and Evelyn's hand over his on the reins, and the way the school on the east end of Calico Falls had a light in it every morning now, 2 lights, because Alice Dyer was an early riser too. The door opened behind him and Evelyn came out with a cup of coffee in each hand, which meant the children were asleep, and she sat down beside him on the porch bench and handed him his cup, and they sat together in the cooling air with the gold cottonwoods and the emerging stars and the sound of something, a great horned owl, starting early this year beginning its evening inquiry out over the dark plain. "William James wanted the poem about the sea again," she said. "He always wants the sea," Patrick said. "He has never seen it," Children always want the thing they have not seen, she said. That is actually a very good sign. He looked at her. The porch lamp was lit and it made the evening warm around them, and her face was calm and beautiful and fully present in the way it always was, the way it had been from the first night at his table. "Evelyn," he said. "Patrick," she said, in the same tone, which was a small joke they had, a small private thing. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." I did not know 3 years into closing my door that it was still possible to be this. He stopped, looking for the word. "Glad," he said, finally. "To be this glad." She was quiet for a moment. The owl called again, farther now, carrying its question out over the dark. Then she said, "I think you knew it somewhere. I think that is why you opened the door." He thought about that, about his hand on the latch before his mind had a chance to interrupt, about the way a thing can be known below the level of knowing, in the body, in some older part of a person that grief and time cannot entirely reach. "I think you are right," he said. "I am often right," she said, without emphasis, which made him laugh. They sat on the porch until the cold drove them in, the two of them, side by side in the lamplight with the autumn dark all around, and the stars overhead doing what stars do, keeping their permanent, indifferent, beautiful watch over the small lighted places where people have decided to make their lives. Inside, William James and Clara Rose slept in their new rooms in the addition that Patrick had built with his own hands, the extension of a house that had been meant for one, and was now entirely insufficient for that purpose, and entirely sufficient for its actual one. The fire was banked in the main room. The books were on the shelves, sorted now by some system of Evelyn's that he had never fully decoded, but which she could navigate blind. The school primer she was reviewing for the spring term was on the table. His own notes about the spring breeding plans were on the other end of the table. Her coat hung on the hook beside the door, his beside it. The door that he had not opened for 3 years. He had answered before he could stop himself, and the life he had let in was this one, wide and full and grounded and still growing, like the country around it, like the green coming up through the old dead grass every March, like the light over the eastern ridge every morning, painted fresh, as he had told her that first evening, as she had agreed with him on that first March dawn when he had taken her to see it. Like all of it, persistent and luminous and entirely, remarkably, specifically itself. He helped Evelyn bank the fire for the night and checked the barn one last time. Moss was 12 now, quiet in his stall, and gave a low, contented sound when Patrick opened the door, the sound of an old horse who is warm and fed and has everything he needs. Patrick put his hand on the gray nose in the dark and said, quietly, what he had said to no one until Evelyn and now said to her regularly, that things were good, that things were going to be all right. Then he went back inside and latched the door, his door, the door of Dry Creek Ranch, where light showed in the windows every evening now and smoke rose from the chimney every morning, and 2 children slept in the addition that had been built with intention rather than necessity, though it was both. And the Kansas night settled around the homestead the way it always had, enormous and cold and blazing with stars, unchanged by anything that happened beneath it, and also, somehow, witness to all of it. He came to bed in the dark and she was already there, and she said sleepily, "Is Moss all right?" "Moss is fine," he said. "Good," she said. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind in the cottonwoods and her quiet breathing beside him, and the house held the children and the fire and the books and the accumulated particular weight of a life that had been built with care from the ground up, from one knock on a door in October, from one hand on a latch, from one word spoken rough from disuse come in. That had changed everything, not by force or drama, but by the simple, irresistible fact of one person showing up at exactly the right moment and another person, somehow, not being able to keep himself from answering. Outside, the Kansas plain stretched in every direction under the winter stars, as it always had and would, vast and severe and beautiful beyond any ordinary measure. And somewhere along Dry Creek, the cottonwood leaves that had not yet fallen whispered in the cold air, and the owl carried its question out over the dark, and the morning was already assembling itself on the other side of the night, already golden, already coming.